Hello Fringers! In this video I'm going to show you how to use my breakaway crochet techniques to work this Sprouts shawl. The free written pattern for this project is available in my Ravelry pattern store. And in this video I will focus on specific concepts that might be hard to understand by reading the pattern alone. So let's start by having a closer look at what we will be making. This shawl is made up of this square motif. If we work these squares in a specific sequence and use my breakaway crochet techniques, then we will be able to work all the squares in the shawl continuously and joined as you go. Looking at a single square, it is worked over 3 rounds. Because we will be working this square continuously, and because this square is more than 1 round, there are special steps to do when working the very first stitch of the square, as well as the very first stitch of each round. Other than that, most of the work is pretty straightforward until the last round. It's at that point where we will need to pay attention to which sides of the square need to be joined to a neighboring square, and this sequence will change depending upon the location of the square within the shawl. So don't worry too much if all this doesn't make sense to you right now. I will be breaking the process down into much smaller steps and explaining things in plain English as each new concept comes to hand. So let's get started with the first square. So let's start with the very first square of the whole shawl, and just this square has its very own special instructions, but a lot of things are similar. But one thing to do before we start is, of course, put a slip knot on the hook, but I'd like you to leave a sort of a longer than usual tail. You'll see what's going to happen with this yarn tail in just a moment. Alright, so once you have the slip knot, we're going to make the first stitch of round 1. This first stitch is a breakaway stitch called a floating double crochet. So to make a floating double crochet, start with a yarn over and now make a floating ring. To make the floating ring, do another yarn over, pinch the yarn close to the hook, do another yarn over, and kind of draw the new yarn in with what you're already pinching. And you kind of got 2 pinched loops. Another hint is to, since this is the very first stitch, things can kind of start rolling around the hook. Just make sure you have a spare finger to hold everything in place, and that will make life much easier. Okay, so let's finish this floating ring with another yarn over and pull through the 2 loops you're pinching. So these 2 loops here are the floating ring, and they will count as the center of our square. That's the center ring. So that replaces magic rings or chain 4s with a slip stitch. In this case, we're doing a floating ring. Okay, so let's finish off the double crochet part of this stitch. And to do that, we use the loops that are already on the hook. So just yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, and pull through 2. So there is our floating double crochet, first stitch of round 1. So continue with 2 more double crochets into the floating ring. So find those 2 loops. That's where you insert the hook. Draw up your loop and finish your double crochet. 1 more double crochet. And now it's time for a kind of a special kind of a picot. I've got to say each round is going to have a picot, and they are different on each round. They're not too hard to do, you just need to keep track of which one to do when. Okay, so for round 1 we have picot 1. To do that, it's just chain 2, and now we're going to make a double crochet, and we're going to insert the hook into these top 2 vertical bars of that last double crochet we've made. So kind of think about going back into the top of the double crochet and then grabbing that next kind of vertical thread there, pull through and finish the double crochet. Almost done. Just need 2 more chains and slip stitch in that very same place we made the double crochet, and there's our picot 1. Now the pattern for the rest of the round is to do 4 double crochets and picot 1. Remember, that's chain 2, double crochet into the top of the last double crochet, chain 2, slip stitch. All right, continue that pattern, chain or 4 more double crochets, picot 1, and one more time, 4 more double crochets and a picot 1. You should have 4 picot 1s. We're almost done. We just need 1 more double crochet for this round, and close the round with a slip stitch into that first double crochet. And there's round 1 finished. Okay, for round 2 we're going to start using another breakaway crochet stitch. So normally this would need to be a treble stitch as the first stitch of this round. And in the traditional way, you would have done 4 chains to stand in for that treble to raise the hook up to where we need it. But we're going to do something different. So instead of chain 4, we're going to use the yarn tail. And with the yarn tail, I'd like you to do 3 loops on the hook that lie behind the working loop. So just grab the yarn tail, then go around from front to back, 1, 2, 3, and those are the loops required to finish off a treble stitch. So that's all we need to do now is finish that off. Just do yarn over, pull through 2, and again I'm holding on with the fingers so nothing unravels, pull through 2, pull through 2, and there is a treble stitch done there. I want it to look like a treble stitch, which is what we get by doing it in that method, because that will help us with our next picot. So for round 2 we have picot 2, and it is an entirely different way of doing a picot. So to do a picot 2, start off with a chain, and now we're going to work a double crochet into the second pair right here of vertical bars of that treble crochet. So if these 2 here were the first, here are the second. So just insert your hook through those 2 bars there, finish a double crochet, continue with chain 2, and in that same space work a slip stitch. In fact, all the stitches for this picot are going to go in that very same place. Alright, continue with chain 3, slip stitch in the same place, chain 2, another double crochet, and let's finish it off with chain 1, single crochet. So there's our picot 2. It kind of has sort of 2 picots and a chain 3 loop in the middle of it. And that's why I'm calling this shawl Sprouts Shawl. It kind of looks like a little sprout that's emerging from a new garden. All right. Okay, so let's continue this round with chain 8. And we need to do a normal treble from now on. So that belongs, we skip the next picot 1 from round 1, skip a double crochet and go into the next double crochet. So in essence, we're going to be working a treble that kind of sits between the 2 picots there. So a normal treble stitch and another picot 2. Just to review, we've got chain 1, a double crochet into the 1, 2, second pair of vertical bars of the treble stitch, chain 2, slip stitch, chain 3, slip stitch, chain 2, double crochet, chain 1, single crochet. There we go. So that is basically the pattern until you get to the end. So I'll just go ahead and finish that up for you. So I've continued that sequence of chain 8, treble, picot 2. I'm now at the end of the round, so at this point I should have 4 picot 2s. And instead of finishing with the chain 8, I'd like you to do something a little bit different here, which helps us get to the next round. So instead of chain 8, just do chain 4 here. And now we're going to find, this first one can get twisted, find the first picot 2 of the round, and we're going to work a double treble into that first single crochet of that picot 2. So yarn over 3 times and work that stitch there on the first stitch of the picot 2. So what that does is that gives us a chain 8 space, but it leaves our hook right in the middle of that space, which is just where we want it. Okay, let's carry on with round 3. And we start round 3 with chain 8. And we work the next stitch of this round into that chain 3 from the next picot 2. And that stitch will be a treble. So let's do yarn over twice. Find that next picot 2. You might have to kind of pry it apart a little bit and just go through there and work a treble. Now for picot 3, and this one's a lot easier. A picot 3 is just chain 4 and a slip stitch into the top 2 vertical bars of that last treble. a lot like a normal picot you've probably done before. There we go, picot 3. Continue with another chain 8. And we've got another unusual place to make a stitch here. We are going to do this time a double crochet, and we're going to go into the first set of vertical bars of that last treble we made. So remember how we went into that chain 3 space? Just look for the next 2 bars. That's where we do the pull through for the double crochet. So what that does is that makes kind of a Y stitch. Okay. Now, above the double crochet, we've got a picot 4, or picot 3 we chain 4 and slip stitch. There we go for picot 3. And that's essentially the corner. Carry on with chain 8. Slip stitch into the next chain 8 space. Chain 8. And repeat that corner just like we did before. The treble into the next chain 3 loop of the next picot. Picot 3. Chain 8. Double crochet into that first pair of vertical bars. It's going to seem like it's going to be a long way away. So you're skipping a chain 8 and most of that treble to go down here for that double crochet to make that Y stitch. Picot 3. That's our second corner done. Now, we just need chain 8 and a slip stitch into the next chain 8 space, and that is as far as we're going to go on this very first motif. We've reached the breakaway point, which means it's time to move on to the next square that will sit just to the right of this one. This looks kind of sprawling. It's kind of difficult to spread it out because of the chains. But in essence, you should have worked 2 corners, come around with a slip stitch in that next chain 8 space, and now it's time to move on. And also, before we go on to the next square, I just want to reiterate that because this square was the very first square of the entire shawl, it had its own special instructions. So from now on, whenever we add a new square to the shawl, we've got a new set of instructions to follow. And what that means is each new square will have the same instructions for working the first 2 rounds. Alright, so whenever we start a new square, we work the first 2 rounds, and instead of repeating everything step by step, I use the abbreviation work first rounds, or WFRS. So whenever you see that abbreviation, work first rounds, or WFRS, this is what you do. We start with chain 12. And at the end of the chain 12, we need to put in a stitch marker. That's because we're going to drop this loop off the hook in a minute, and we don't want that to unravel. Okay, so this chain 12 is kind of a connection between the one we're about to do and the previous one. So these chains will kind of get eaten up as we go by either this square or this one. Alright, so you'll see how that works as we go along. Okay, so to start round 1 of our new square, start with 3 yarn overs and a floating ring. Remember, that's yarn over, pinch, yarn over, pinch, yarn over, pull through 2. Now remember, the first stitch of round 1 is a double crochet, and we're going to use these first 3 loops on the hook to do that first double crochet. So yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. There's our first double crochet of the round done. And these extra 2 loops on the hook, we don't need those for now. We're going to save this yarn to help us work the next stitch on the next round, as well as this loop here. So since we don't need them right now, let's drop all that off and put our hook back into the working loop. Now we're good to go for the rest of the round. So as you can see, we've got the chain 12 and the slack yarn, and then our floating double crochet. Okay, so from now on, round 1 is the same as we did on the first square. And picot 1. And remember, we have that pattern of 4 double crochets, picot 1 for the rest of the round. And after the 4th picot, another double crochet and a slip stitch into the next stitch. There's our round 1 finished. Okay, to start round 2, we've got a stitch called a restore treble, and that's where we use all this business behind the hook. Okay, so to do a restore treble, first thing to do is to remove the stitch marker and take the hook out of the loop, and being careful that nothing gets pulled apart. Come to the loop that's on top of the chain 12, put the hook in. With the slack yarn, we're going to make 2 yarn overs, so just dip your hook from front to back, 1, 2, to make 2 yarn overs. Find the working loop, get that back on the hook, and then we're all set up to do the first treble of this round. So finish that off with yarn over, pull through 2 3 times. Alright, and again, we've done this kind of convoluted process here. That is what enables us to skip from one motif to the next without cutting the yarn. You see, we've basically started a new one continuously. Okay, so let's continue with round 2. Again, it is the very same until we get to the very last picot 2. So remember, it was picot 2, chain 8, and treble between the next 2 picots in that double crochet there, and picot 2, chain 8, and so on. Now continue and end with that last picot 2 of the round. Okay, so I've worked to that last picot 2 of round 2. We're almost finished with round 2. The last thing to do will be to chain 4 and slip stitch around this connecting 12 chains. But before I do that, and now that I've got everything kind of laid out, when we start round 3, that's where we will start to be joining things together. So once we do the chain 4 slip stitch here, we will have another chain 4, which gets us halfway through a chain 8 space. We need to join in that space there. Chain 4, start this corner bit, and as we work the chain 8 space of this corner, or as we work this chain 8 space at this corner, I should say, we join it to this one. All right. That's a lot to get your head around, so I'm going to break that down and go very slowly and give you a little trick that I hope will help you out to keep track of where you are. Okay, first things first. Let's finish that off with chain 4. And find those connecting chains, slip stitch around there to make a chain 8 space. There we go. Okay, so round 3. Now let's start joining things up. First of all, make sure everything is right side up before we start. You've got your previous square on the left and your one you're working on the right. Start round 3 with chain 4. And now to kind of set up things to help you find your way through, what I'd like you to do is take the working square, pass it over the top one, just kind of do kind of a side step kind of thing. So I've got the working one now in my left hand, the previous one in my right. And I'm going to find this first chain 8 space on the previous square. So that's that first chain 8 space behind the hook. And slip stitch into that. There we go. Now that was the first chain 4 of this chain 8 space. Let's do the second chain 4. There we go. And to complete the chain 8 space, we go straight on to the corner biseau. Remember that starts with a treble into that chain 3 loop, picot 3. Okay, so here we go. We're going to start, remember a chain 8 space that'll go in the corner here, but we've got to join it up to this one. So start with chain 4. And again, if we're looking behind the hook, we've got 2 picots to go past. Let's see if I can, there we go. Past these 2 picots and find that chain 8 space in that corner and slip stitch into that. Alright, well, let's finish that chain 8 space with another chain 4. We're ready for the double crochet that goes into that first pair of vertical bars of the treble and picot 3. There we go. So that's joined up our first 2 joins there. Let me try to lay that out so you can see. You can check your work. Okay, so there's the join we've just made there, joining the 2 corners, and that join here, which joins these 2 chain 8 spaces. There's some chain 8s that are left from the beginning chain 12. And to continue with round 3 on this second square, we just continue without any joining, just like we did on the first square. And remember, we stop on this chain 8 space here. All right, so basically working halfway round. I'll go ahead and work that off camera for you. There we go. So just to review, after where I left off just before, after that picot 3. I did the chain 8, slip stitch, chain 8, and all that corner biseau, another chain 8, and a slip stitch into that next chain 8 space. Okay, so to go on, we will be doing, the pattern calls for 4 squares per row. So to do the next 2 squares, they are worked exactly like we've just done this one here. So I won't go through that again. Just remember that the next 2 squares are exactly the same as this one, so if you need to refresh your memory, just rewind back. And for this sample, I might just work one more just to save time, and you don't really need to see all the squares to understand what to do. So I'll go ahead and slot in just one more square here to the right of this one, and that will be our foundation row of squares finished. All right, and just a quick reminder, each square starts with that chain 12 that connects. Work first rounds, where we do the first 2 rounds, and then we start round 3 by connecting those 2 chain 8 spaces there and ending kind of halfway round in this chain 8 space there. So just remember, you've got a kind of an orphan chain 8 space on top of each square. And again, for this sample, I'm just going to do 3. For the pattern, you would do 4. If you want it wider, that's very easy to do. Just make sure you have enough yarn if you want to make things bigger. But for now, it's time to go on to the next phase here, where we finish off the top of these squares here. That's called a return row. So let's get going with that. So when you're on your last square of the row, you pretty much just continue on around with another chain 8 and that corner deal, chain 8, slip stitch, chain 8, corner deal, and then chain 4 and slip stitch into, this is what I mean by the chain 8 space that's going in between the 2 motifs. Alright, so what does that look like? I'll work that off camera for you. So there we go. I've made my way round to that last corner, ending on that last picot 3. And here's where we kind of transition between this square and the next one by doing that chain 4 and slip stitch in the middle. And that, again, by chain 4 here and slip stitching, that creates a chain 8 space there. Let's go ahead and do that. So that's basically finished off that last square. And we're kind of in between squares now, so let's transition to this next one here and finish it off. Continue with chain 4. And here's another interesting step we need to take. As you can see, we're ready to start a new corner on this motif here. And when we make this new corner, it's got to join up to the previous one here. So we're kind of joining the sides in 2 sort of operations here. Okay, so what we do after the chain 4, after we've joined between the 2 squares, let's start off that next corner, again with the treble, into the chain 3 space, picot 3. All right, begin the chain 4 corner space, the chain 4. And again, we've got to join up the corner we're making to the one before. And just slip past the 2 picots that are behind the hook, find that corner space and slip stitch into that. Finish this chain 8 space with the next chain 4 and the double crochet into the first pair of vertical stitches, loops, whatever you want to call them. Picot 3, and there you can see now that the 4th square is totally finished and it is joined to this middle square here. Alright, so to continue on, that is the sequence pretty much. Continue on with chain 8, slip stitch into this chain 8 space, chain 8, do a corner biseau, chain 4, slip stitch into that chain 8 space, chain 4, and then do that join just like we've done here. So I'm back and I've just done that corner biseau and joined it up to the previous square. Another way to check your work before we go on here is once you get past this first corner that gets joined up to a previous square, you want to make sure you've got 4 joins between squares. If you can see that, it helps if you really understand what just a single square looks like. But there are 4 joins here that kind of line up along the corner. Okay, so make sure, sometimes it's easy to forget to make this last join on the return row, and if you forget, that means you've got a frog back. So make sure you've got all your corners joined before we move on. Okay, so now that we're back at the last square of the row, if I'm calling this a return row, working this way, here's the last square, and we have a new breakaway point here. So once you get past picot 3 here in that first corner that you've done on this row, do another chain 8, slip stitch into this top chain 8, and that's where we leave it for this row. And that means we have completed the first row of squares by doing a foundation row and a return row, and now we're ready to move upstairs. We're going to make the next square up here, so that's the first square of the next row, and we started again the same way. Remember, with the chain 12 and the working the first 2 rounds, and after working the first rounds, we continue around our square, making the next chain 8 space, join up into this one here, and this next corner joins up into this slip stitch here that happens where those 2 corners have already joined. So we're going to have a third corner join up with these 2 that are already there. Now let's go through that. And I should say it's pretty much the same thing. It's just that because we've gone up instead of over, the orientation just looks a little bit different, but everything else is exactly the same. So again, I've got my working square here. Okay, and I chain 4 to start the next chain 8 space off. And I don't really need to do a side step because of the way it was just now laying. We're all ready to follow along behind the hook and join up into that space there. Chain 4. Start the next corner. Just remembering when I get to that first chain 8 space, I only need to start with the chain 4, and again for the join, go past those 2 picots behind the hook. We're skipping these 4 chains here and slip stitching into that intersection. I like to go into, you see how there's that kind of that hole there. I like to go in there to do a slip stitch. Doesn't have to be that way, that's just how I do it. Alright, so that's joined our new corner. Continue with chain 4, double crochet into that first pair of bars, picot 3, and there we go. That's made all our joins for that first square. And for this first square we just need chain 8 and slip stitch into the next chain 8 space. And by stopping there, that has gotten us kind of a quarter of the way around that square, which means it's ready or time now to go on to the next square here. Okay, so begin again by working the first rounds, and once that is done, and we kind of lay this out so you can really see where this is going to be sitting, we can tell that this square here joins on 2 sides. So we've got, from now on, for the rest of this row, we've got more joins to do. So let's make sure we understand that. The first one, again, is just like we've been doing before with the chain 4. Let's do our side step deal. Look behind the hook, find the first chain 8 space, slip stitch, chain 4, start the next corner, chain 4, and again we're skipping back behind the hook 2 picots, and this time we've got our 4th corner that's going to go in that same intersection. So try to go in that same place you did last time as you can. It just kind of looks better if you find a plan and do the same thing each time. Don't have to do it like I do, but that's my suggestion. Okay, so we joined, do a chain 4, and finish off the corner with that double crochet and the picot 3. So that's these 2 sides, or at least half of the side joined. We've got 4 joining here in the same spot. Now as we work our way around to the other side of this square, as we continue, we've got another chain 8 space that connects into this one, and another join here in this chain 8 space. So these are much easier to do. So just continue on with chain 4. Go behind the hook and find that first chain 8 space behind the hook. Chain 4. Come back to our working square and find the next chain 8 space here. And slip stitch. And now let's join up in our next space, doing chain 4. Joining here, chain 4, all ready for the next corner. Again, this one is joined as well. Let's start it off, the treble and the picot 3. Now here comes that chain 8 space that goes right in the corner. Start with the chain 4. Again, looking behind the hook, go past 2 picots, 4 chains, and into that next slip stitch. Just going back around here. Again, you can see, you can also suss that out. It's where those 2 corners have already been joined before in the previous row. You're making that 3rd corner join in, chain 4, double crochet, picot 3, and finishing up with just chain 8 and slip stitch into the next space. And that's as far as we're going on that square. So that's really, from now on, the difference. We've got more joining to do, and as you can see, these extra joins are not too hard to do. The corners are pretty much the same deal, just going back behind picots and finding the place. And we've got this time 2 joins here. All right, before we go on. All right, so the last square of the row, start off the exact same way and join into that last corner there. And once you get halfway around on that last square, then it's just time for another return row. So I've gone ahead and put that 3rd square, or the last one of the row, in. I've also finished off the tops of those squares with a return row, just like I did down below, so there's nothing new there. And from now on, that's pretty much what repeats. That is to say, the way we did the squares on this row is how we will do all the rest of the rows until the shawl gets to as long as you want it. Okay, so you just have to remember that on this last square, you stop in that chain 8 space and go upstairs and start the next row. But for now, let's pretend like this is the 16th row, which is how many rows the pattern says to do. And I'm going to show you what would happen then after you've got all your rows done. And basically, it's just another return row kind of deal, but along the side to finish off these edges of these squares. And just continue, the corners and the chain 8 spaces, the slip stitch in between, and remembering to join the corners, the new one to the previous. All right. So I've gone ahead and slotted that in. I've done this first corner on the last square, joined it up, and ended with that picot 3. And on this very last square, instead of a chain 8 here, we do the deal of the chain 4 double treble. Again, because we want the hook to end up at the kind of the peak of that chain 4. All right, so I've done chain 4 and a double treble into the double treble we did in the beginning. I think I might have asked you to mark that first double treble in the pattern. I can't remember. So there might be a marker there to help you out. Okay. So that's the main section done. And now for the border. No real big surprises with the border. It's all pretty much traditional stitches. So To do this first round of the border, all you need to do is chain 5, slip stitch into each chain 8 space, chain 5, slip stitch, etc., chain 5. So you're basically chaining 5 and slip stitching into each chain 8 space. And when you get to where 2 corners intersect, you'll also have a slip stitch in there. So chain 5, slip stitch, chain 5, slip stitch, chain 5, slip stitch into the intersection. So do that all the way around, and slip stitching into the beginning. There we go, and I'll just turn it the way we are used to, the way we worked it. And the rest of it, again, is pretty straightforward. I think the only other thing I'm going to show you is there's a special stitch on the next round that occurs in the corner. And there's one more picot, picot 4 that we use on the last 3 rounds of the border. It's very simple to do, so I'll just go over those 2 things for you now. I'll go ahead and start round 2 in the border and meet you at the corner here. Okay, at the corner, I've gone ahead and done a treble right in the corner. And by the way, I think I asked you to mark the corners as well, so there might be a stitch marker there in your project. Good idea, because sometimes it's easy to lose track. But anyway, in the corner, we start with that treble, which I've already done. And then a chain 1, and now we've got another of these sort of Y stitches, but it's slightly different than the one before. So again, in that same slip stitch in the corner, to do that Y stitch, start with a double treble, and now chain 1, and the other part of the Y involves a double crochet, and again that goes into the second stitch or vertical bars up from the bottom. And there's another little Y stitch. This time let's be good and mark it so that we don't fly past it by mistake on the way back. Okay, so in the corner, after the Y stitch, do another chain 1 and another treble stitch into that same corner. Okay, as promised, let's go over picot 4. And these occur on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th rounds of the border. I've just finished the 2nd round of the border here, and I'm ready to start the first picot row. So let's just start with the chain just to get the hook up to where we want, just for this very first picot. And this picot 4, very easy, all in the same stitch. Work single crochet, chain 3, single crochet, chain 5, single crochet, chain 3, and single crochet. Kind of a bigger looking sprout there. And basically making a mesh kind of deal with chain 7 spaces. And skipping 1, 2, 3 spaces and going into the next stitch with the next picot 4th. I won't do that now. And that's basically the gist of this border pattern. The only other thing I've got to say is on the next round, when you're working a picot 4, they're going to occur at the 4th chain of these chain 7s. I'd like you to work actually into the stitch and not the space. That way all the stitches, that kind of become sort of like a shell. Otherwise, they kind of spread out a bit too much. So that's the only other area of concern here. And probably needless to say, this shawl definitely needs to be blocked to get everything to lie flat and not so lumpy. And if you go ahead and do this project, I would really love to see what you come up with. Please share your projects either on my Breakaway Crochet support and chat group, or I don't know, maybe we'll find another way where I can see your works of art. Oh, on Ravelry, of course. Yeah, and make sure you post it on Ravelry. So I'll leave you to it. I really enjoyed giving you this tutorial. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.